You know, they're just all like, oh, well, I guess we're not going to drive him off, and then they just quit fighting you. It's weird. I don't think you can tell anything really about the demeanor of bees that you're going to be working when you're doing a cutout, because you're just devastating their home. You know, there's no way to predict.
You end up with this people, you know, do these. I was stung 40 times. Oh my God, they must be Africanized. Well, what were you doing? Well, I was taking this, you know, diamond blade saw to the block wall and stuff.
Yeah, I would expect any bees to get wound up at the sound of a saw. Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes the pitch is just right to set them off. Because I've mowed right in front of hives and had them not even notice me, and then sometimes you just, I don't know, if the weed eater or whatever, and you'll be just sets them off. It's hard to say, but I don't really care about their ancestry. I think having them tested is a waste of time. If they're mean, I think you need to requeen them, and if they're not mean, then I think if they're not mean and they're Africanized, then you've hit the mother lode, because you've got good hardy bees that aren't mean. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'd breed for gentleness, definitely, survivability, productivity, and if they're mean, I'd call those out. But I actually think it's that simple. But natural food's my third step. This is pollen, by the way. You see all the variety of pollen they gather. Every different color there is a different plant. I don't even know why I have to even talk about this, but for some reason, all of a sudden in recent times, pollen substitutes has really become a big deal. Back in the 70s when I started, it was like, well, you know, maybe you should give them a little in the spring to kind of give them a kick in the butt and get them building up a little sooner, and maybe you should give them a little in the fall to make sure you got plenty of bees going into the fall, but that was pretty much it. Nobody put a pollen patty on a, or even a pollen substitute patty on a package, because there's pollen available. Why would I give them pollen? There's pollen out there. But the whole concept of feeding bees when there's food available for them to forage is a total mystery to me. The reason humans keep bees is that the bees forage for us. That's why we keep bees. They forage for us. They go get their own food. I can see in a fall, when I've got a fall dearth and they're really desperate and they're gathering sawdust, maybe I might be able to give them something more nutritious than sawdust. But all in all the studies on pollen and pollen substitute is that bees raised on pollen substitute are short-lived. They don't live very long. What do you want short-lived bees for? I don't know what good that does me. It doesn't do me any good in the fall. I need long-lived bees that can get to the spring. And if I put a pollen substitute patty on with a package where I live in the spring, it does nothing, because they're going to go out and get pollen. There's pollen available by the time I get a package. So what's the point of the substitute? They just ignore it. I end up throwing it away. It doesn't accomplish anything. Here, you put a pollen substitute patty on there, and the small hive beetles will have a smorgasbord, and they'll love you forever. But the bees won't benefit. So that's all I'll say about that. I think it's you have all these newbies who are starting, and they still think these are pets, and they think, you know, you have to feed your pet. So we have to get the pollen substitute and the syrup so I can feed my pet. Well, but if there's nothing available for them out there, by all means, feed them. But if there's food available, why are you feeding them? I don't understand the concept. But let's talk about some of the downsides. Sugar syrup. Sugar syrup is definitely a different pH than honey. Now, as far as how this affects the microbes in the gut of the bee, Martha Gillum did some research on the shift in the microbes in the gut of the bee when you feed them sugar syrup and when you feed them honey. She didn't really come up with a mechanism as to why. I'm speculating on the mechanism, but we know for a fact when you shift the pH, you shift what lives and what doesn't, and what thrives and what doesn't. And sugar syrup is not the same pH as honey. Sugar is basically neutral, which and honey is a little bit acidic. Almost every reproductive disease, plus nosema, and the brood diseases are AFB, EFB, chalk brood, all of those reproduce really well at 6.0. And none of them reproduce very well at 4.5. Nosema also reproduces really well at 6.0 and not very well at 4.5. This is just an observation by Jay Smith, but he was a very observant guy. I really enjoyed reading his stuff. I don't always agree with him 100%, but I agree with quite a bit of it. And he used to raise bees in Indiana, and then he moved to Florida and raised bees in Florida, and he was observing the difference as far as AFB. There was a lot of AFB in Indiana, and there wasn't much in Florida, and in Indiana they fed a lot of sugar syrup, and all the beekeepers he knew in Florida never fed sugar syrup. And he was speculating that that was the reason there was more AFB, and now there's research to actually back that up. But that was just his observation. I just did a search on pH and chalk brood and pH and whatever, and you can come up with all kinds of studies really easily on the fact that all of these brood diseases reproduce best at 6.0, and they don't reproduce very well at the pH of honey. So if you try a search on pH and any of those diseases, you can pretty much find that kind of research. There's tons of it out there. The other 8,000 microorganisms in the colony, of course, are also affected by changes in the pH. In this case, in the case of when we were talking about treating the formic acid and the oxalic acid, we were shifting the pH dramatically to the acid side. In the case of sugar syrup, we're not as dramatic, but we're shifting it to the middle, from slightly acidic to neutral. And that again affects what lives and what doesn't. Yeah.
Michael, the question I have is, we do aquaculture as well, when we alter the pH of the water, depending upon the finish of the medium. Is altering sugar syrup an alternative as far as pH is concerned?
I do. I put, I basically I shoot for trying to get it to be about 4.5. And mostly I started doing it because the syrup keeps way better. The syrup will spoil, but then I don't feed very much syrup, so it's not like that's... Feeding syrup is not in my management plan. It's what I do if they're going to starve. But yeah, I put ascorbic acid in it. Now the problem with other things I've tried, like vinegar, is the vinegar always seemed to set off a robbing and feeding frenzy because they could smell it. The ascorbic acid, they don't seem to be able to smell it, but it shifts the pH, and it seems to make it pretty palatable. And actually there's some research out there that the ascorbic acid is actually good for them.
Vitamin C.
Yeah, it's vitamin C, yeah.
Just crush a tablet?
I go to Sam's Club and I buy these 1,000 milligram, it's not a capsule, but I don't know what you call it. It's long, but it's, yeah, I don't know, tablet. I just throw it in the water, and when the water's boiling, it dissolves. I don't crush it or anything.
Powder form and stuff for when you're doing
You probably can. I've just never, Sam's Club was convenient. You can get it wherever you want. But basically I'm making 5 gallons of 5 to 3 syrup, and I put about 7 grams of ascorbic acid in there. Now, I can't guarantee that's what's going to work for you because it depends on your water. There's a lot of lime in my water, and it kind of acts as a buffer. That might be way too acidic for yours if your water's funny stuff, you know. And
Water management requires the pH be around neutral.
yeah, so basically you can buy test strips for pH, and you'd really want to experiment and figure out how much it takes to get your water to that.
A lot of people aren't well, so they're one well to another, it's going to be different.
Yeah, it could be different from one well to the other, depending on how much lime. Like lime tends to be in your water, and the lime tends to be a buffer. It tends to make things more neutral. If they're more acid, it tends to make them more neutral, and if it's alkali, it tends to make it more neutral. So it tends to be a buffer. But so you have to see what works. But
Mike, are you familiar with the pH of corn syrup? A lot of the commercial people buy this toast corn syrup. Is that the same as sugar syrup?
corn syrup over the years has varied a lot, and it has been an issue. Sometimes it was way too acidic, and it killed a lot of bees. I think right now it runs at a little bit. It probably runs right around neutral. I think that's their goal. I think their goal is to be neutral. That's the goal of sugar, too. It's neutral for a reason. They made it neutral. They purposely, engineered it to come out that way. I think most of it tends to be neutral now. They used to, and I think part of it is because there was a time when they were making it and they were using acid in the process. You guys understand high fructose corn syrup is in no way a natural product. You take some starch and you chemically try to alter it and break it down pretty much by brute force rather than by any reasonable. They used to do it with acid mostly, and that was why they ended up with some that was way too acidic. Now they're trying to do it more with enzymes, but they still do a combination, I think, of enzymes and acid to break the starch down into sugars. So they're kind of brute force taking these long chains and trying to break it into pieces to turn it into sugars, and it's.
Not as healthy for the bees as regular sugar.
I've never fed it to them. I haven't, but there's studies that say that, yes.
Well, that corn is a really toxic product as well, and it's actually Monsanto and everything that they spray on that is the same thing as.
Well, the neonics now are permeating the entire plant, so I don't know what they could do or if they are doing anything to try to keep them out of the corn syrup. I don't know how you could. Neonics are a very complicated issue, but what I think we really ought to worry about on the neonics is that we're eating it. I think I like bees a lot, but I'm really more worried about my grandkids than I am about my bees, because this stuff it binds to acetylcholine receptors, and it never lets go. So I'd say in 10 years we're all going to have Alzheimer's. And the problem is we won't remember why. So Monsanto can do whatever they want. I try to leave them honey. That's my plan. My management plan is to try to leave them enough honey to get through the winter and not feed them sugar syrup. Do I ever feed them sugar syrup? Sure. If I think they're going to starve, I always feed them. Actually, quite often I feed them dry sugar anymore. But one of the arguments for stealing all of their honey and feeding them sugar is that honey's worth more than sugar. I've never quite understood that argument because it takes a lot of work to harvest all that extra honey, make all that syrup, haul it out there. Anybody who ever does this math is always just telling me what the cost of sugar is per pound and what the cost of honey is per pound. And they never take into account that in order to do this, I have to spend more work harvesting more honey, and then more work making syrup, and then more work feeding the syrup, and buy the sugar. So I don't really think I come out ahead on it. That's my opinion, but then I'm a lazy beekeeper, so my idea is to minimize the work. And then if the bees aren't as healthy, then I've just created more problems for myself. So, and then that's not counting, I don't know how often I hear people say, well, feeding can't hurt. Feeding can devastate a bee yard. Apparently they've never set off a robbing frenzy in a bee yard by feeding, but I've seen it. And let me tell you, it's scary. You don't even want to be around. It's just scary. But seriously, feeding tends to set off robbing. I'd try and avoid it just for that reason. But I've got all these other reasons besides. So would I feed them if I think they're going to starve? Well, I'd rather set off a robbing frenzy than have them all starve this winter. At least some of them will survive, right? But all in all, I try not to feed them. That's my goal. So leaving honey, I think, actually isn't that far behind. But that's always the argument, is that it's worth more money. The upside of leaving the honey is I don't have to worry about setting off a robbing frenzy because I'm out there trying to feed syrup in a time when there's a dearth and now they're all fighting over it. I don't care what feeding method you use. Everybody claims they've got one where the bees don't drown, but I haven't seen that one yet. If you'd like to tell me yours, I'll listen, but I have serious doubts. About the best you can hope for is a jar, but even that'll get hot and then just dump syrup down on them and there's this sticky mass of bees in your colony. It's just almost any way you feed bees, a bunch of them drown, and I've never enjoyed that. It's obviously a lot less work because, like I said, I not only saved the amount of work it took to harvest that extra honey and make the syrup and haul it out and feed it. It just all adds up. And then there's all those trips to the bee yards. Now, for those of you who just have them in your backyard, maybe that's not such a big deal. But when you got bee yards scattered over several hundred square miles, you got to do a lot of driving to go do that. Less brood diseases because that's what disrupts that biofilm in their gut, which is protecting them from AFB and EFB and chalk brood and so on. And you haven't messed with the ecosystem of the hive. So that was 3. We're going to go to 4. My 4th one is natural comb. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I get tired of the topic, really. I was not treating and keeping bees for a long time, and the varroa came along, and they all died. And I got some more bees and put them in there, and they all died. And so I decided I was going to have to treat them, so I put Apistan on them, and they all died from varroa every time. So the only thing I ever found that solved my problem was to either get to natural cell size or small cell size, and then my varroa problem went away. I haven't had any varroa issues in years. And frankly, I get tired of talking about varroa. Everybody still talks about it like it's the primary beekeeping issue, and it hasn't been a beekeeping issue for me for more than a decade.
They treat it like it is problem number one down here.
Yeah.
It is
Well,
the
and
object of the University of Florida and the state of Florida.
And I will say it may be more of a problem for you because I get a brood break. I get a brood break every winter, which you don't get. And that may have an effect too, but yes.
We don't get the break. We get a little bit of a break in the winter. No, I was going to say, they had a bee college here a few weeks ago in August, and I didn't go because all they talk about is treating pests, and I don't have pests. I mean, I have some small hive beetles, but I don't have many. And I don't want to go and learn about treating pests. I want to
Right.
learn about how to keep a good beehive.
Yeah,
And
You're in the
not
right
my-
place.
That's part of my frustration. I'd really rather talk about bees, and they want to talk about varroa. I don't. But anyway, so you can believe that cell size will help with varroa or not, but I never got the varroa problem under control until I changed the cell size, and that's the only thing I changed at the time.
I have not been in this for a long time, 4 years, but all my hives, and I do use foundation, but all my foundation is small cell foundation. I don't have any varroa problems.
Yeah, he does not have a varroa problem.
Well, see, I can't predict how it is down here, but it sounds like it works here.
I had
But I can.
Florida A&M come out do studies on my hives. The only hives that had varroa in it were the ones that had foundation that was large cell in it. That was it.
Right. So, if you want my opinion, this is what I did that solved my varroa problem. Now everybody's trying to come up with a genetic solution. Well, I'm all for raising bees that are surviving without treatments. I think that's the right thing to do. But
Genetic solution.
it didn't solve my varroa problem. That's all I'm saying. But either it helps with the varroa problem or it doesn't. And there's these short-term, sometimes well done and sometimes poorly done, but always short-term studies. And there's 2 or 3 that prove that it does help, and 10 or 15 now maybe, I don't know, they keep accumulating, that are usually not more than a month long that prove it doesn't work. I really ought to tell you a little bit about bee research though. Do you guys understand how research works? I'll explain it to you briefly. Let's just pick a name. Ann Smith is, let's say, she's an entomology student at the University of Nebraska, and she's working on her doctorate thesis, and it's getting down to, she's got a month left before she's got to get this thing in, and she goes to the professor, and she says, I got to get this thing done. I've thought a few things over, and this is what I wanted to do for my research. And he says, well, you only got a month left, and I've only got 2 hives that I can spare for your research, and what are you going to do that you can get something and prove something in this 2 months? And so she puts together something, and they put together this study, and they do it on these 2 hives for 3 weeks because he still has to grade it, and so they do this little short-term 3-week study, and she writes up her paper, and he puts his name on it as the researcher, and she puts her name on it as the whatever. She gets on the byline somewhere in there, and 2 or 3 other people make it on the byline, and they publish this paper that now declares some new wonderful thing we didn't used to know about bees. And that's how research is done. That's exactly how it's done. And that's how all of these facts that you get from all of these places, like the USDA and all the colleges and whatever, come about. They come about from short-term research that's done with almost no money, almost no hives, for no period of time, and they're almost always trying to, in order to control everything, quite often they're doing it with caged bees in a laboratory. And how are you going to come to any conclusion about caged bees in a laboratory that has any actual application in real life? I don't know. But anyway, that's what I think of bee research. I have a lot more faith in a beekeeper who's been doing it for a few years and it's still working, what got me on this road was D. Lusby. After all my bees died when I didn't treat them, and then they all died when I did treat them, I got desperate and I started trying to find somebody who believed it was possible to keep bees alive without treating them. And she was the only person who even purported that it was possible at the time. Nobody else even seemed to think it was even possible. And she was doing it, and her and her husband, and they had over 1,000 hives that they weren't treating. And so I was impressed. I went down and spent a week with them and looked things over, and I started down that path. I've never regretted it. But frankly, either it helps or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I'll give you a bunch of other reasons to do it. But the facts are, Standard Foundation has been upsized from what the bees would have built. See, the whole idea of Foundation was to incite the bees to build the cells we wanted them to build, and we didn't want them to build drones because drones are lazy bums who sit around and don't do anything, right? Never mind that they fly out every afternoon until they're totally exhausted trying to find a queen to mate with, and then fly home every night, and they do this every day, 7 days a week, rain or shine just about, unless it's really pouring down rain. They're out there trying to mate with a queen and perpetuate the species, which I think is an important job. But anyway, that was really the original object of Foundation, was to get rid of the drones. But then the secondary object was, somebody said, well, if a little bee can haul a little bit of nectar, a big bee should be able to haul more nectar. So let's see if we can make a bigger bee. And so they stretched the Foundation and tried to get a bigger bee, and it worked. They got a bigger bee. They got a bee that was half again as big as a natural-sized bee. And that's, if you're buying Standard Foundation, that's what you've got. You've got a bee that's half again in volume the size of a regular bee. That's it. My son, who has no interest in bees whatsoever, notices the difference. He goes to the state fair and there's a observation hive in there, and he goes, man, those bees are huge. You know, those are way bigger than your bees. What's the deal? And I was like, yeah, well, you've never paid any attention to any of the bee conversations in the house, have you? Which he didn't. but the point is they're half again as big as they should be. So the fact is we've upsized the Foundation and we've got bigger bees. Those are facts. You can argue all you want about the rest of it. Here's a recent one it was done in 2000 or so by these two guys in Ireland, I think, basically proving once again that upsizing the Foundation has upsized the bees, and that bees on the Foundation that was being used back at the turn of the century are smaller bees. That's what that whole study there was about. There's plenty of historic references. You could have proved it anyway, but everybody was still arguing over those for reasons that baffle me, and so they decided they'd just prove it once and for all, and so they did the research again. But
how long does it take to get a overgrown bee back down to normal size?
Put them on normal size cell, a generation. If you let those large cell bees build comb, they're going to build something smaller, but they won't quite make it all the way down to natural size in one shot. But if you've already have small cell comb, they're going to do it in a generation because they'll just use the comb. Probably take you 2 turnovers of comb minimum to get down to maybe 4.9 at the core of the brood nest, and it might take you 3, but because the problem.
Older comb will eventually become small cell.
That's true too, because the cocoons will build up, but it'd take you a decade to build up any significant amount. I wouldn't count on that for a way to regress them, but I'll briefly touch on regression. I really didn't want to get sidetracked on regression, but I'll briefly touch on regression. Basically, the idea is bees build a cell based on their body. You know, anybody know what a cubit is? Yeah. A cubit's the distance from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. So my cubit may not be the same as your cubit. So if you've artificially upsized them by 150%, they aren't quite going to build natural sized cells. They're going to build something smaller than the artificial stuff you were giving them, but not quite as small as what they would have built. So that's assuming we're just letting them build their own comb. If we give them Foundation, they might be more likely to build it smaller, and if we give them our already drawn small comb, they're just going to use it. But the problem is getting a big bee to build small comb. And the threshold that's generally thrown around as far as dealing with the varroa is 4.9. If you can get the core of the brood nest down to 4.9 or smaller, usually you've crossed the threshold on your varroa problems. So that may take a,
Point, our acclimated bees here are much smaller than small cell. We're more about 4.5, 4.6.
I believe that.
You already made the first observation. It seems to go by latitude. Our southern bees are
True.
small.
True. She has made that observation, and yeah, I've seen some of mine that were building 4.6, but 4.9 seems to be the threshold to deal with the varroa problems. Natural may eventually end up smaller. I've seen some 4.4 from Pennsylvania that,
I have some 4.5 in my top line.
cool. Take pictures of it, the ruler on it, send them to me. Of course, somebody will just say, well, they're Africanized. But anyway, that's always their excuse for everything.
Yeah, Africanized bees build smaller cells, yeah.
So let's try a few reasonable assumptions. I think it's safe to assume that the bees know what natural size cell should be, what cell size they should build, right? And if we assume that they know the answer and we let them, they should probably answer that question. They should build what's natural size. Now, and I'm going to assume that natural size is the correct size. Now, the only problem with this whole thing is what I brought up before, and that's that they've already been enlarged, and so they tend to, since they're building it based on their body size, it might actually take a couple of turnovers of comb to get all the way back to natural size. But other than that, I think
African ones we have are not large.
well, it may be really simple for you to get down that small then. The disadvantages to natural comb, I think a lot of people have a lot of. You have to change the way you think when you're working a hive. If you're a beekeeper and you've been doing this for years, and you're used to dealing with foundation, then you're used to being able to pick up a comb and turn it any way you want, and it doesn't fall out. If you're doing foundationless and they haven't connected it yet on the bottom or the sides, and you pick it up and you do that, the comb falls out. Now the funny thing is, if I take a beginner who's never done this before in my bee yard, and they do that once, they turn it sideways and it falls out, they never ever do it again. But I take an experienced beekeeper, he'll do that 5 times in my yard that day. And every time he does it, he gets madder. but it's an ingrained habit, you know. So sometimes change is difficult. You got to change the way you think. When you pick up a comb, you got to think about it. You got to think, is it attached on all sides? If it is, then I can do this. And if it isn't, well, then I better be careful. So once you make that mental change, it's not so bad. They are more fragile at first. Actually, they're not all that fragile once they're connected on all sides and it's been there a while. Brand new wax is really soft. With or without foundation, it's really soft. And once it's matured a little bit, it's a lot tougher. And so once it's a lot tougher and it's connected on a few sides, you can pretty much treat it like you would if it was on foundation. You do have to level your hives. Now, this usually isn't a big deal for the backyard beekeeper, but if you're a migratory guy who's loading them up on pallets and hauling them somewhere and just dumping them on the ground somewhere, level becomes a lot more work, perhaps, to try and get the hives level. But they build combs plumb. For those of you who aren't in the construction business, that's straight up and down with gravity. This is level. This is plumb. They're going to build it plumb because they have their own plumb bob. It's this cluster of bees hanging, and it's going to be plumb. Now, if the frame's like this, the comb's going to be like this. Because the comb's going to be plumb. The frame may not be plumb. So the point is, if the frame's plumb and the comb is plumb, then it lands in the frame. If the frame's not plumb and the comb's plumb, it could actually be attached to this one on the top and the one next door on the bottom. And that isn't what you want. So you may have to level your hives. Everybody always says, how level? I take a level out there and I put the bubble between the lines. That's what I do. Now does it stay that level? It probably doesn't stay that level, but the more level I get it to start with, the better it stays in the long run. So do I always do that? Yeah, I try to. You know, sometimes I don't have a level handy and I've got to move this hive to a different spot, and I do. But
one of the things I actually do is I kind of tell them to not go exactly level. Part of the reason is if you're not using a screen bottom board and it rains down here.
If you have a solid one, you want to lean it a little toward the. But see this comb is what matters is that the frame's plumb. So as long as the frame's plumb, yeah, it can be leaning forward so that the water runs out. Don't get too carried away leaning them forward, though, man. I've seen some that are, you know, they keep growing, and then since the weight's more on this side than this side, it keeps sinking more on this side than this side, and then over time it finally goes over. So you really only need about 1/8 of an inch fall on a bottom board to make the water run out. A quarter's more than plenty. But yeah, you don't have, it's mostly getting maybe I should say you need to have the frames plumb rather than the hives level, huh? The advantages to natural comb, I think it's a lot less work. I can't believe how many people think it's more work. I don't understand what's more work. I go out and I find some hive that's been devastated by wax moths because it went queenless, and I go in there and scrape it down and put the frames back in and go home. I'm done.
The thing that they complain about is the crossing of comb from one frame to the other.
The one thing you got to understand about foundationless is one good comb leads to another, and one bad comb leads to another. Bees build parallel combs, and once you have a bad comb, don't hope they're going to get the idea and straighten it out. They won't. They're going to keep building what they're building. They're going to build another comb parallel to that comb. That's what they do. So if it's crooked, you cut it loose and tie it back in the frame straight. In frames, it's easy. In a top bar, it's a little trickier because you don't have a frame. It's easy. Just keep a few rubber bands in your pocket, and there's nothing to it on a frame Langstroth hive because you just cut it loose, slip it over, throw a couple of rubber bands on there. They'll chew the rubber bands off later. You don't have to worry about them.
One of the things I've noticed with hives in the wild and stuff, especially with bees that are in like soffits and stuff, other bees we've been talking about that, is while bees may build parallel, it's not usually straight. It's often S-shaped. And my guess on this has often been help control wind currents and stuff to help control the temperature of the hive. So the bees will build them parallel, but they'll often build them in an S shape in order to help control temperature of the hive.
And I think some of that may also be strength. I think a curved comb is stronger than a perfectly straight one.
Yep.
But certainly one straight one leads to another straight one, though, and one curved one leads to another curved one.
Yeah.
But even the curved one, I can cut the ends loose and bend it around back in the frame and put a rubber band on it. But they have a tendency to want to curve the ends of it no matter what. There's people all the time making foundationless frames. They say, "Can I just put it in the middle?" You know, the home guide. Well, and I always say, no, you want to encourage them as much as possible to go all the way to the end straight because they're going to want to curve the end. You don't want to encourage them to curve the end. You want to discourage it. But all in all, I think it's a lot less work. The one thing you do, the other thing you probably do need to understand is that there's a difference between broodcomb and honeycomb. Broodcomb is a very consistent thickness. And so you get one good straight broodcomb, you can stick an empty frame between two straight broodcombs and they'll just draw a beautiful, perfect straight broodcomb every time because it's in the brood nest. And broodcomb is consistent. Honeycomb, on the other hand, could be this thick or this thick. And it's not consistent. And so once they start doing honey, sometimes they just say, well, let's just make this one fatter. And it'll go all the way over into the next frame. Of course, to me, that's not too big a deal if it's honeycomb and I'm going to harvest it. Well, I tend to wait until it's, of course, you can't do this here. I wait till it's cold enough they're all clustered down there and I can just pull it off. I don't care, but you can get a leaf blower and blow them all out of there and harvest that and crush and strain it. It wouldn't really matter. But the other thing you get is you get clean wax. The problem with wax is when you buy foundation, it's already contaminated because the entire wax supply in the world is contaminated. The cosmetic people are all buying their wax from Africa where people are too poor to buy the treatments because it's the only place that they can find clean wax because all the rest of the world beeswax supply is contaminated. That's the only place they can go and get anything that's clean. So if you want clean wax in your hive, the only way to really get it is to quit using foundation because the foundation's all already contaminated because they melt it down and they make it into foundation. And there have been several studies in recent times where they've looked at the contaminants that are in the wax in the foundation already. And then you get healthier bees, of course. It's really the only way you can get clean wax, like I said. The only other way is if you kept your own wax and you get a press and you make your own foundation. Now, D. Lusby does this and Kirk Webster does this, and I can't comprehend. It's mind-boggling to me the amount of effort and work that goes into doing this to build something that the bees would have built anyway. I can't grasp it, but I've been with Dee and I've made a little bit of foundation and I know what it takes to do this. It's a lot of tedious work, but you could do that. That would be your only other way you could really get clean wax. The contaminated wax the Coumaphos, in particular the Coumaphos, the Apistan, and the Amitraz are the three acaricides that are building up in the wax. And all three of those cause infertile queens and infertile drones. So they shorten the life of your queen. And that causes frequent supersedures and losses of queens because they're not very fertile. The bees sense it and they try to replace her. And then the next one's not any more fertile because your wax is still contaminated, your drones are still not fertile, and so on and so forth. So you end up with, and they're bound to have an effect on the bees. Nobody's really spent a lot of time trying to measure anything on the longevity of the bees in a colony where you've got these contaminants in the wax. But the fact is, if you look at the life of a bee and their longevity and look at when they do what, you know, they're a house bee, and then they're maybe a guard bee, and then maybe they're drawing some wax, and then maybe they're, you know, finally they're foraging over here at the end. Well, they don't forage for very long. If you shorten their life by even a little bit, you've cut in half the amount of time that they're foraging. And if you shorten it a little bit more, they're not foraging at all. And you've got to have some foragers out there on the end. And so you shorten the life of these bees even a little tiny bit, you have a huge impact on the economy of the colony. You know, oddly enough, I think it kind of works the other way around too, though. I think really what whoever you want to credit it with, you know, evolution or God, but whatever you want to credit it with, it seems to actually be important that they live the amount of time they're supposed to live, because if they live too long, there's too many mouths to feed in the winter and they starve. If they live too short, there's no foragers to go out and forage. So you really need that to be just right, is what you really need. But if you shorten that by a little bit, I think you're really hurting it. So how do you get natural comb? If you take a standard wedge frame and you break the wedge out of the wedge top and you turn it this way and glue it and nail it back in, you'll have a ridge that sticks down about a 1/4 inch on one side and 1/2 inch on the other side that is now right down the middle, believe it or not. I didn't think it would be until I tried it. Somebody told me they were doing it and I thought, well, isn't that going to be lopsided? But then I tried it and it's not. It's right down the middle. It makes a ridge right down the middle of the frame. And what the bees need in order to build comb in your frames is a guide that convinces them that that's the spot they ought to be building. So that gives them a guide. Another guide, if you've got a groove in the top bar and you don't have a wedge, you can just take, they're usually called jumbo craft sticks. I probably shouldn't call them popsicle sticks because popsicle sticks are only about 1/4 inch. And a craft stick is like almost 3/4. We would have called them tongue depressors when I was a kid, I think, but maybe they don't use tongue depressors anymore. Surely they do. But anyway, it really is like a tongue depressor, but you can buy them at the craft store in boxes of 1,000, you know. Anyway, those are easy to use. A paint stick will work. If you're good, if you're handy with a table saw and you know how to not cut your fingers off on one, you can just set it to, you know, 1/8 of an inch or so and just rip off little strips yourself. I don't recommend you go buy a table saw if you don't know how to run one. I wouldn't want you to cut your finger off over the deal. But if you're already handy with one, that's a good way to get strips. If you've already got a drawn comb and it was wax foundation, you can just cut the old comb out and leave a row of cells around the edge, and they'll just rebuild it right in following those. If you've got an old comb, if I've got an old frame with no comb in it and I'm out in the bee yard, I just stick it in between 2 brood combs in somebody's brood nest and let them draw it, because I don't want to haul it back to the house and put a comb guide on it if it doesn't already have one, and they'll draw that fine. I've seen people do this. I've never tried it. It looks like way too much work to me. But you can cut the middle out of one of those plastic frames. I've seen people take a saber saw and just drill a hole to start it and then cut the middle out of a plastic frame and then leave a row of cells all the way around it, for one thing for strength, and for another thing it'll give them a little guide all the way around. I think that's too much work. I think you ought to sell them to somebody who wants those and go buy some wood ones, but some people just, you know, can't part with what they got. What can I say? I got a stack of large cell plastic foundation that's been sitting in my basement for 15 years now, so I somehow can't bring myself to throwing away something to get hauled to the dump that somebody's still manufacturing somewhere just seems wrong, but it seems wrong to use it or talk anybody else into using it, so I don't know what to do with it. I don't know if you can see but if you look at the back, you can see there's kind of a V. It's hard to tell in this picture because it's in 2 dimensions, but there's actually a V. I bought these from Walter T. Kelly. Now you can actually buy foundationless frames from them, but I just bought a bunch with no groove in the bottom bar and no groove in the top bar and ran them through the table saw and cut a V on the top. I probably like these the best, but it's not that big a difference between all of these different methods I just said. They all work about the same. This is, I think, a little bit stronger. That V-notch seems to be a little bit stronger when you go like this a little bit than some of the other methods. But then you shouldn't be doing this, right? So,
Is there a way to encourage them to build on the bottom or on the sides to attach it? If they don't?
you can, in my opinion, most of them aren't worth the effort. But yeah, you could put a. I have put a triangular bottom bar on there to encourage them to attach it, and they are a little more likely to attach it a little sooner, but they attach it sooner or later anyway.
Melted wax line around the.
I forget the wax. I never wax anything on there. They don't.
You build wax tubs and dump your hives in them and stuff.
Oh, well, that's true, but I don't wax anything on a frame to get them to build comb. I don't think it really works.
How about wire going through?
You can put a wire in it if it makes you feel good. It's always in my way. Every time I tried it, and every time I want to go cut a queen cell out, I go, oh darn, that wire runs right through that. I can't cut it out, and they just always seem to get in the way. And then in the supers, if it's brand new, nice white wax, and it's too soft to harvest, to extract, then I like to cut it up for comb honey because it's nice and soft. It's nice and white and soft. And if there's a wire running through it, it messes that up. So I find the wires to be not only a pain to put in, but they're always in my way. But you can put a wire in there, and it would be stronger.
What I was told, like when you do the wax foundation, and you have to manually sink that wire, you have to sink it into the wax, or the bees won't build on it. They won't build to the metal.
The queen tends to avoid the cells that have the wire in them. Even if you embed it, they still tend to avoid the cells that have the wires in them. I don't know.
If you use fishing line though, the plastic, it works better.
I've never used the fishing line. I've heard people who love it and people who say the bees just chewed it out. So maybe it depends on your bees. I think some of them are more aggressive on chewing things out like that. Yeah, you can wire them if you want. I don't. Can you extract them? I extract them all the time. Pretty much I sort through mine and decide this is a nice straight mature comb. And by mature I mean if you look at this, can you see that kind of yellow tint to that? When bees build wax, it's bright white when they first build it, and eventually if they get time, they come back and they paint it with something that they secrete from their mouth that turns it that yellow color and changes the consistency of it from this soft putty-like stuff into something that's much tougher and stronger. Once they've done that, you have mature comb, and that's easy. I extracted this right after I took this picture. In fact, I was in the middle of extracting when I took this picture. I said, well, that's a good one. I should take a picture of that. Once it's a mature comb, I have no trouble extracting it, but I tend to go through them. If it's all crooked, then I really don't want to keep it anyway, and I just crush it and strain it, unless it's nice and soft and white, in which case I cut it up for comb honey, because I've always got a market for some comb honey. I've always got a market for some extracted honey, and good comb honey is that nice white stuff that's so soft that it's not hard to chew. Yeah.
So you're saying that yellow is actually a substance that they're secreting
Yes.
onto it.
Yes.
I've seen some hives that are obsessively yellow,
Yes.
where they put it on the hive body itself.
That's acacia trees. That's pollen tracked in from the acacia tree.
Oh, okay.
Or when Brazilian peppers.
When the
run.
Brazilian pepper blooms,
The
the
doorway
mine
turn
yellow.
Some of that could be pollen being tracked in too, but Huber goes into great detail on the steps of them building the comb, and you can tell the difference between that white, soft, putty-like stuff and what it is after they've painted it with that yellow stuff. It's totally changes the consistency.
When they're building comb, when the Brazilian pepper's running and they're building that comb, that virgin comb is actually a yellow, a bright yellow, fresh comb.
Like they
It's
go
just
track the
because of what
hive.
they're,
Huh.
it's definitely different.
Wait till you see it turn red. It's like some tape chips.
So one of the things people are always saying is they'll build nothing but drones. In fact, I'm amazed how many old beekeepers tell some new beekeeper who wants to do foundationless that they won't build anything but drones. And then, so if they already have an established hive and they stick a foundationless one in the middle of a brood nest and there's almost no drone comb in the hive, that's exactly what they build. They build a frame of nothing but drone because they've been wanting to do this for a while, but none of the foundation, nobody started any drone comb. See, bees, if you understand how a colony thinks, part of how a colony thinks is every bee looks at what's there and says, well, I got to pick up where they left off and finish this, you know? And the bees who are starting it are the only ones who are actually making the decisions on what we're going to do. The rest of them just look at, okay, we need to finish this. So you give them foundation, that's all in worker comb, and they look at it and they go, okay, I guess we better finish this worker comb, and so they finish it. Now you finally gave them a place to build some drone comb, and the ones starting it have been wanting to build drone comb for forever. Now you finally gave them a place to do it. They look at that and they go, oh man, finally we can build some drone comb. And they build a whole frame of it. And so you freak out and you take it out and you cut the comb out and you put it back in, and what do? They build another drone comb. And you take it out and you cut it out and you put it back in, and what do? They build another drone comb. And you say, they won't build anything but drone comb.
And that goes to the fact that you want these drones made and out there in your bee yard. These are the drones you want.
That's true too. But and the fact is they actually will waste a lot of effort trying to raise those drones until you let them. I just let them. So yeah, the first frame or two they will draw nothing but drones if they haven't had the chance because they've been wanting to. Now if you're starting with a package, usually they won't draw any drone for a while. They'll just draw workers at first because they're trying to get established. They don't need any drones right now. They don't need more mouths to feed until they've gotten established, and then they'll start building some drone. So there's really a limit to how much drone they're going to build, and if you keep taking it away from them, they'll keep building it to replace what they were that need they were trying to fill. So, and then there's the won't they mess it up? Won't they build the comb every which way? Well, I've watched them mess up comb all my life when I was using foundation. I don't see that much difference. The difference is this. With foundation, they get a clean slate every frame because every frame there's another wall that's established a straight line again. And that is helpful because with foundationless, once they built that one wild, the rest of them are going to be wild. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's all going to be wild. So it does have the advantage with foundation that everyone's a clean slate. But I've seen so much buckled foundation that got hot and buckled and they build it every which way, or they just ignored it, build it in between the two frames and didn't build on the foundation at all. And now it's attached to two frames and I got foundation in my way and whatever. I've seen plenty of messed up comb. I don't see that they mess it up anymore doing foundationless, but they do mess it up. Sure, they mess it up on plastic. They mess it up. How many of you have done plastic and they build little fins coming out right angles on the plastic? Isn't that cute? It's of no value whatsoever, is it? Or they decide to build this one that comes out from the surface and then runs parallel to the plastic. And now you can't get to the back side of it here because it's... the bees will mess stuff up now and then. They do what they want. They don't see it as messed up. You got to see it from the bees' point of view. From the bees' point of view, they did exactly what they wanted to do. So, and then the weird one is that some old timers tell new keepers all the time is that they won't draw a comb if you don't give them foundation. I don't even know how to respond to that one. But obviously, they've been building comb for millions of years. But now, any of these things I'm talking about, you could do at whatever rate you want to attempt it. If you want to get very aggressive, though, you may stress them out a lot. Dee Lusby basically did shakedowns. She shook all the bees off of the combs, took all of their combs away from them, and put them on smaller cells, and made them start from scratch. And she did that not once, but twice. She did that once to get them to 5.0, and she did it again to get them to 4.9. And of course, she was experimenting. Only Dee would experiment on that scale, you know, shake down 1,000 hives to 5.0 to decide that you really should have done it to 4.9, and then do it again to 4.9. But she did, and she stressed them out a lot, and she lost a lot of bees to yeah.
But that work, I mean, because we're talking, you're saying 1.5 times the size, you know, of what the bee would normally be. I mean, can you make them squeeze into a 4.9 foundation?
Oh yeah, the queen will lay fine in it. The bees will work fine in it. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, the way I regressed them, I really cheated. I kept trying to figure out how to get this done in a short amount of time because I didn't want to treat anymore. And I bought some permacomb and I looked at it, and it was, I was estimating it at 5.2 at the time, but the reality is it's like 5.2 at the mouth, but it's like 5.0 at the base because it's tapered. It's a fully drawn plastic comb. And so I took that and I heated it up to 200 degrees in my oven, dipped it in beeswax, shook the beeswax off, and made it into 4.9 at the mouth, which is about 4.7 at the base probably. And I put the bees on it, and I had one hive out of hundreds that the queen wouldn't lay in it, and they just superseded her. They built some cells somewhere else, got her to lay an egg and raise a new queen. But I had one that she just plain couldn't lay in it, I think. But she was probably deformed in some way. There's something wrong with her. She was way too fat. She was just huge.
I did the same thing that you did and stuff. And the first time I did it and stuff, I thought I had a laying worker in there because the regression takes a generation or two, and the first set of bees, they were all bubble cells and stuff, you know, and I was like, they must be drones, but they were work eaters. But the next generation after that, the comb was flat and stuff on the permacomb. I remember that. I posted pictures of that on Beemaster.
I've seen a little, yeah. Sometimes workers have a little bit of an arch to the
well, these had
cap.
the big dome to them. They were still going through. This is the first generation for the regression.
I've seen worker comb with a little bit of arch to the cap, but I've never seen one that actually looks like half of a Kix cereal.
Yeah. It's there.
But yeah, I didn't have any trouble getting them to lay in small cell if I had small cell. Just that one queen, and I think she was deformed. I think she had a problem, and they replaced her. Somebody suggested perhaps she had something wrong with her ovaries, that things were backing up in there, and that's why it was so big. I don't know. I couldn't say, but you can kind of just you could do this over a 5-year period, or you could do this over a year or two. I'd probably do it over a year or two myself. I wouldn't do the shakedown like Dee did. Anyway, she stressed hers all out, and they got a lot of AFB from all the stress, and then she lost a whole bunch of hives to AFB. People like to simplify what they understand about things and then draw conclusions from them. There's all these people who think that Dee did her shakedowns to small cell because of Varroa, and that she lost all these bees to Varroa. She did these shakedowns before Varroa was even here. She did it because of tracheal mites, and she did it back in the 80s, the early 80s, and she didn't lose them to Varroa. She lost them to AFB. And I don't know, there's all these people who say, well, she just selected for bees that could survive Varroa. There wasn't any Varroa. She wasn't selecting for bees that could survive Varroa. She was shaking them down to try and solve her tracheal mite problem. But anyway, and she didn't lose them to Varroa. She lost them to AFB. But then she finally she went the second step to 4.9, and then the Varroa finally got here. But anyway, you can do it fast like her, but I don't recommend it. I think you'll just stress your bees out. Or you can take your time and just push them in that direction without trying to stress them out. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's more of an art than a science. Let's say you want to try and replace all the comb that's in there with natural size comb. So you come in the spring. Well, you don't have a spring. What am I talking about? I don't know. I mean, where I am, if you went in the spring and most of the comb's empty, I can pull it out. It's no big deal because it's empty. But I don't know if you have any time when yours is empty. But if you go for a time whenever you find an empty comb, if you pull it out and replace that with your foundation list, you get there eventually. You might have to get a little more aggressive here. I don't know. Maybe
splits out of certain ones, and then you put empty ones into it.
Now, if you let them build natural comb, they're not going to go to the small cell though. They're going to go to maybe their size of their own bee though, correct?
Yeah, they'll end up whatever they are, but they may be 4.4 millimeter. They might be 4.6 millimeter. They might be. My guess is it's going to be 4.9 or smaller after a couple of turnovers of comb, though. You're not going to be 5.4, which is standard foundation. But only if you actually turn the comb over again. I'd measure it and see where you're at, because you kind of want to. Once you get to 4.9 in the brood nest, then I'd let them do whatever they want. It'll all work out. But until you get to that point, you may still have Varroa issues. I don't know.
A number of members actually have swarm boxes out there to try to catch swarms.
Right.
I was curious, have you ever
figured out whether the bees prefer a foundationless versus a foundation swarm box?
An old piece of comb is a big attractant to a swarm. As far as foundation, I never put foundation in a swarm trap. I try to put some old brood comb in there, and then I'll have a bunch of foundationless frames because I think they like to have a place to cluster when they move in there. The swarm is kind of thinking in terms of making a cluster. I think you're better off with like 1 or 2 old brood combs and foundationless, but that's my opinion.
Done a swarm box where I had the frames going this way and went to open it up and they built the comb this way. Connected all the frames, it was a mess. It's good to put one old comb in there.
And you know what to do then. Flip the box upside down, lift the box off, and then cut them loose and do a cutout.
Swarm box.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, you could kind of play it by ear, but you could even confine the queen or just take some of this brood comb, move it above an excluder, wait for it to emerge, and then harvest it if it's full of honey, and swap stuff out that way while you're feeding. In other words, you're feeding empty frames in between the combs and the brood nest, and you're pulling brood comb out, putting it above an excluder so that the brood will emerge, and then you're going to pull those out. If they're full of honey, pull them out and harvest them. If they're not full of honey, just pull them out if they're empty. And then just keep doing that. Pretty soon you will have replaced the brood nest. I'm not big on an excluder, but it is a nice way to make sure the queen isn't going back and laying in them again when you're trying to get them out. Anyway, that was, yeah, what do you do with all the large cell foundation you spend all that money on? I'm still trying to figure that one out. But find somebody who's going to buy a large cell even though you try to talk them into small cell and sell it to them. See? Hey, or give it to them, whatever works for you. Yeah, but I don't run an excluder, and I don't want the queen getting up there and laying in it. It just puts me back in the problem I was in when I was trying to regress them. So worst case scenario, assuming cell size doesn't matter for Varroa, it's not going to hurt to have natural size cells instead of enlarged cells, and you get to rotate your combs out, which everybody recommends you do, and I never do, but there's a big push to do that, and I think it's important if you're putting chemicals in your hive that you do, but I'm not, so I don't. It's a lot less work, and it's not contaminated, and
They're saying a lot of some of the contamination for the waxes from what the bees are bringing back into the hive.
Well, everybody likes to make that argument, but all the research I've seen where anybody actually tried to measure the amount of what was what, the number one thing that was in the hive was, well, the top 3 were Apistan, Cumulphos, and Amitraz, which was all coming from the beekeepers. So you can argue that there's stuff that's coming in, but it's at a pretty low rate. Those are the big ones. You're talking. Yeah, is there other insecticides getting brought back? Probably, but not at that high a rate, I don't think. But
I'll find the study for you that shows what they're still bringing in. I'll send you.
Oh, I'm sure they're bringing in stuff. They were actually bringing the study by Mary Ann Fraser actually said they were bringing back DDT, among other things.
Wow, where are they getting that?
Exactly.
It
Where's
still exists in the soil.
DDT is extremely long-lived. So are neonicotinoids, by the way. So anyway, assuming cell size does matter, then you've solved your Varroa problem, and you still get the clean wax and the healthier bees and less work. So that was my 4 steps. No treatments, breeding local survivors, natural food, and natural comb.